Hello and welcome to this webinar looking at sustainable worm control. This is part of the Beat the Parasites campaign. This campaign is brought to you by Boehringer Ingelheim Animal Health and Farmers Guardian and aims to offer information, advice and best practice guidance on all aspects of parasite control. I'm Katie Jones and I'm Head of Livestock at Farmers Guardian and Editor of Dairy Farmer. I'm joined today by Professor Eric Morgan from Queen's University Belfast, who will be talking about how to stop wormer resistance from eating through your profit. Sinead Timothy, Technical Services Manager from Boehringer Ingelheim, will also be joining in with the discussion following Professor Morgan's presentation. As we start to look ahead to improve weather and ground conditions, turnout is hopefully just around the corner. So with many livestock farmers about to embark on the grazing season, now is the ideal time to put integrated worming strategies in place. Worm infections are estimated to be costing UK livestock producers about £270 million in terms of lost production and treatment expenditure every year, with cases in cattle making up the majority of this cost. There are also concerns about increasing resistance to anthelmintic treatments, so it is important to make sure farmers take the necessary steps towards increased sustainability. So, to tell you more about why individual farms' worming strategies might need to be challenged and how this can be done, I will hand over to Professor Morgan.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining. So I'm going to talk through some of the basics of parasite control and how we need to change the way we strategically approach worm control on farms to make it more sustainable. So I'll start off by discussing what we tend to do now in cattle especially, but also in sheep, why this is inherently unsustainable and how we can make treatment more targeted and therefore more sustainable in practice. So just to recap what happens in terms of the seasonal epidemiology of parasitic gastroenteritis, the infective larvae are on the pasture, and we'll start at the beginning of the year. They survive quite well over winter. They like quite cool conditions. They don't like hard frosts, but they don't like warmth either. They like to preserve their energy and they stay on pasture over winter. When spring arrives and temperatures increase, then they will tend to die. As you can see in this green shading here, the pasture larva levels will get lower in spring. And when you turn animals out, they'll ingest these larvae, save them from extinction, and they'll mature into adult worms and start producing eggs. And there you see the brown line as being the egg counts rising early in the season. If we don't intervene, then that will continue to rise and fuel another cycle of L3 or infective larvae on the pasture through the summer. And you can see that in the top green line. And what we're actually doing by worming early in the year is to push down that egg output from animals that have been turned out. And therefore, we're pushing down the larvae, the number of effective larvae on the pastures later in the year. This is called early season suppression. And it's really worth recapping that when we worm animals in the first half of the summer, we're not necessarily just protecting them as individuals. What we're actually doing is pushing down that egg output so that those pastures will be cleaner for longer, and so we don't have to intervene so much later in the year because we've suppressed that transmission. So far so good. This is widely used. So particularly if you use longer acting preparations, you don't have to repeat worm. You can suppress parasites for longer, or you can use shorter acting wormers and use them time and time again to keep that level of infection low in the early half of the summer and then save yourself from infection later in the summer. So it's very effective. Unfortunately, it's also very unsustainable. Why? Well, there are 5 reasons really, and anthelmintic resistance is the one that you hear most about, and I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail. But there are other reasons. So if you protect animals too much early in the grazing season, they don't get a lot of infection, which means they don't get exposure and they don't get immunity. And that means you have to do the same thing again in the second grazing season, and sometimes you have to do the same thing again in adult animals. Climate change is changing this seasonal pattern. What I've shown you as a template is typical for Northwest Europe, UK, Ireland, and that's pretty much been unchanging. Now we're seeing much more variation. We don't we don't see it in infection patterns where we still use a lot of wormer. But if resistance comes to the fore, as it seems to be doing, then those climate change patterns will become more obvious and more problematic. We also have environmental impacts, which I'll come to, and potentially food residues. And these are issues around climate change, environment, and food, which in the past have been delegated almost to consumer choice. Those individuals who care a lot about these things have the choice of where they purchase their meat, their milk, etc. But now it's becoming more and more regulators who are laying down what you can and can't do as farmers in this space. So just have one slide for each of those. Antibiotic resistance, well, we know that it's a big problem, particularly in the sheep industry. So this graph just shows the proportion of farms over the years that are showing resistance to different antibiotics. And the dotted line in the middle is white drench resistance in sheep in the UK. And you see from the 1980s through to the present day, a gradual increase in the proportion of farms in different studies that show resistance. And now it's really hard when we go out and look for BZ efficacy, white drench efficacy in sheep. Is really hard to find it. Most farms have suboptimal, lower than expected effectiveness of white drench. The solid line on the right is ivermectin in sheep in the UK, and that seems to be at a lower level at the moment, but rising quickly. Where are cattle here? Well, there are much fewer studies, but a recent study in Ireland found that of 16 cattle farms, all of them showed evidence of drench resistance, in this case to ivermectin. So if it's really that common and becoming a big issue in cattle as well as sheep, why is it that we don't see a massive crisis? Well, we do on some farms, actually. I've certainly been on some farms that have multiple drug resistance and struggle therefore to control worms at all. But it's also the case that we expect 95% of the worms to be killed, 95% drop in fecal egg output when you use these products at least. And where you get a decline from that to say 70, 80% effectiveness, you will still see animals pick up. You're still getting rid of most of the worms, but you're not getting rid of them all. So you can sustain production for a while with a wormer that's not working fully, but of course the proportion of survivors is increasing. So you're now getting 20% of the worms surviving, 30% of the worms surviving. They're carrying resistance genes, and by the time you get down to the 60, 50% and you get big production impacts, it's too late because you've got resistance fixed in that population. So antibiotic resistance is not just something that happens on other farms. It's something that's very likely to be affecting livestock unknown to you, and it's something that you need to take account of for the future, but to consider now, not just when it becomes a problem. Secondly, immunity. I mentioned this, and it's most obvious for lungworm in cattle, for example, where if you go back a few years, lungworm was pretty much only ever seen in young stock under 2 years of age, with occasional cases in adult cattle. It's still the case that most lungworm outbreaks are in young cattle, but at least a third of them now are in older cattle. And that's explained by the fact that a lot of protection of young stock means that cows are joining the milking herd without adequate immunity to lungworm. And if they encounter it, then you get big problems like milk drop. You can get deaths, and it can be a serious financial hit. So even though you do want to protect your young stock, you have to do it in a way that you develop immunity to lungworm, but also to gastrointestinal nematodes, the roundworms in the gut. Climate change, well, I showed you this graph of the seasonal patterns and early season suppression, and really climate change is tearing this up in some years. So the picture you see there is of cattle in Limousin in France. And this was a situation that occurred sometimes in summer where you get very dry weather and you get lack of grass and you get feeding of hay or pasture. And now it's really, in the last 10 years, it's become normal. This is the normal pattern in France now. In the UK, in the southeast of England, you get this quite a lot now, but even occasionally in wetter areas like Ireland, you're seeing this. So a couple of years ago, we had a very dry summer. This will affect transmission, which means in ways that are relevant to resistance. So in this situation that you see, very dry pastures, the larvae in the feces are locked up. They're locked up in the dung, or they've sought shelter in the soil. They're not really available to those animals. So there are two consequences of this. The first is that if you're worming those animals, or if you chose some time ago before the weather got really dry to put a long-acting wormer in them, then that's complete waste, because those animals are not taking in larvae. Those larvae are locked up away from them. More than it being a waste, if you have any survivors of that treatment, any resistant worms in those animals, they're being put out onto this pasture in a situation where potentially there are very few other larvae around. And when you get rain in autumn, those larvae are going to dominate, and you get rapid selection for resistance. And we've seen this in places like Australia with very dry climate. You get really rapid selection for resistance. So you really should be trying not to worm animals in this kind of dry summer situation at all. Unfortunately, this is going to vary year to year. You don't get a dry summer like this every year. So it's not a matter of just changing everything you do every year. It's a matter of maybe giving yourself a bit of flexibility to work with the weather as far as worm control is concerned. Environmental impacts. Well, this is very, very complex and pulls in different directions. But just to break down a couple of points. We know that dung invertebrates can be affected by some wormers, and they're very important in burying dung, recycling the nutrients, and also in soil carbon storage. And if through regulation and subsidy we're going to be more rewarded on farms for carbon storage, then you need to preserve this process. Unfortunately, if you kill the dung beetles, that really takes a big hit. Secondly, we looking at the middle panel, we talk about wetland. So whereas previously you wanted to drain land and improve it, that's not great in terms of water runoff, in terms of water contamination with nitrogen, phosphorus, with coliforms. It's not good for downstream flooding. So water storage on farms is now a kind of a social good, and something that policymakers seek to encourage farmers to provide. Unfortunately, if you increase water storage on farms, you get more wetland and you get more liver fluke problems. So you might think that environmentally, looking at these two examples, environmentally worming is bad. Environmental management to control worms is bad. And what we should do is pull back from that, take some hit from worms in the interests of these wider environmental benefits. It's not so simple though, because we know worms will really increase greenhouse gas emissions from livestock. So that bigger environmental aim of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, especially from livestock production, would take a massive hit if we don't control worms properly. So we need to find a way to both control worms, enhance production, decrease greenhouse gas emissions, but do so in a way that preserves these environmental benefits of water storage and carbon storage in soils. And that's going to be really tricky, but it's not going to be a choice. It's going to be something that society demands. Drug residues I'm not going to talk about in detail, except to point out that where anthelmintic residues are the most common drug residue in animal-derived products, and they can lead to problems, including withdrawal of products. So all of these 5 points tell us really that we cannot just keep going as we are. We've got anthelmintic resistance, issues with immunity, climate change changing the patterns, environmental impacts, and drug residues. So we have to revisit what we do in terms of worm control. Well, you might think that's simple because we just use less wormer and start using different things, and there are other options. So there are vaccines. We know about lungworm vaccine, that's been around for a long time. There are gutworm vaccines in sheep against Haemonchus, but that's not the problem worm really in temperate areas. But there are vaccines on the way for things like Croupiria in cattle. Unfortunately, they're not going to replace anthelmintics because you're not going to get a 95% reduction in egg output for a prolonged period with one dose. Vaccines are going to be smaller reductions in egg output. They're going to have to be given repeatedly, and they're not going to just replace anthelmintics. There are biological control options. The most promising is fungal spores. You can feed animals spores of fungi that will then trap and kill nematodes, roundworms in the dung. Similar issues though, really. Sometimes they work really well and you get 90%, 95% reduction in the larvae coming out of the dung. Other times, if the weather's not suitable, then you can get maybe as low as 20%. It's also a problem that you have to feed these spores. So for animals that are a pasture, it's not obvious how you're going to get the spores into them. There's interest in mixed swards, and some of the plants that go into those mixed swards and mixed forages have impacts against parasites. They also increase protein availability, and that enhances the immune response to parasites and compensates for any protein loss from gutworms. So these are also promising, but again, they're not going to be as solid. Grazing rotations maybe gives you a wider range of options. Same with breeding resistant stock. You can improve the ability of stock to deal with parasites, but eventually you're going to need some help from anthelmintics. And grazing management, rotational grazing, also really, really useful. So I would encourage you to think about these alternatives, but to think about them in terms of using them to maybe reduce your reliance on anthelmintics, but not to completely replace wormers. Instead, you should be maybe trying to use the wormers in a more targeted way. And you can do that in two ways. You can do that within the herd in terms of treating just some individuals, and that's called targeted selective treatment. So you're not treating all the individuals in a herd or a flock, you're just picking certain ones. You can also apply it targeting at group level. So instead of regularly treating the whole group, you wait for the right time, the right place, you decide when to worm the whole group in a more appropriate way. And the aim for both of these is to suppress the parasite populations below the level at which they're going to impact on production, but you ensure that some worms survive. So the whole problem with anthelmintic resistance is the more effective you are with your worming, the harder you push on the parasite populations, it means that the only survivors are resistant. What you need to ensure is what we call refugia, which is some worms that haven't seen wormer, whether they're on the pasture or in the animals. Some of those worms haven't experienced wormer at all, and they will then interbreed with those that are survivors of treatment, and that'll dilute the resistance alleles or resistance genes. And that's your best bet for slowing the development of resistance. So it's not a matter of trying to eliminate all the worms. You're never going to win that battle anyway. You're not trying to eliminate all the time. You're just trying to keep the levels low enough that they don't impact on production, but you allow some of these worms to survive. How do we do that? Well, if you're targeting individuals, you can use what's called the 80-20 rule. If you look at this graph, it's just a number of animals vertically there. So the bars are the number of individuals, and along the horizontal axis, you've got a parasite burden. So circled on the left there is the majority of animals which have really small parasite burdens. And then on the right, you've got a few individuals in any herd or flock that are carrying most of the parasite burden. So if you manage to direct your treatment just to the right-hand side, just to those animals that are wormy, you really decrease the infection pressure and have very successful worm control with much less use of wormers. And what you see on the left there, you're preserving some parasites in those low intensity infections that aren't important, that aren't going to affect production, but they're constantly supplying parasite eggs that are going to generate worms that are going to mix in with the resistant ones. So how can we pick out those individual animals that are shedding a lot of eggs, that are wormy, that are perhaps prone to production loss? Well, you can do it directly just by doing fecal worm egg counts. So you then know which ones are most heavily infected. And there have been studies on farms to address this and test it. So, for example, in this study in Ireland, in dairy replacement calves, worm egg counts were taken every 3 weeks. If the egg count was high, so in this case about 200 eggs per gram, or if lungworm larvae were seen at all, wormer was applied. If you compared this approach to treating all the animals, then about half of the wormer was needed and the weight gain was the same. So you can support production just as well with much less wormer if you target it appropriately to the wormy animals. Unfortunately, to do this, you would need to take individual fecal samples every few weeks, and that's often not very practical. It's a lot of work and it's a lot of handling. So instead, we use indirect indicators of which animals are wormiest and which ones need most help in terms of wormer application. We've tried this in a whole number of settings as part of our research. So where blood-sucking worms predominate, particularly in warmer parts of the world, you can use anemia. You can just hold a color chart up and treat the animals that are pale. You can use body condition without specialized equipment. You can use weight gain, and if you're highly instrumented, if you're doing a lot of weighing to monitor performance, then you can piggyback on that and use that for worming. So if animals are not growing as well as you expect, you worm them, but those that are growing really well without any help from a wormer, you can leave untreated. And you can automate this, and there are systems available to do that, especially in sheep. If you don't have that kind of equipment, there's nothing wrong really with just using farmer's eye, and that's been shown quite effective as well. So by that I mean you've got a queue of animals in the race, and you see those that are doing really well without any help, you let them go, and then those that maybe are lagging a bit behind or you're not quite happy with for whatever reason, whether they're a bit daggy or whether they're a bit thin, a bit behind where they ought to be, then you treat those instead. If you do that, across these studies, this is one example, but it's fairly consistent with the 80-20 rule. So you can manage to maintain the same levels of production with only 20% of the wormer. But it does require some monitoring. So it's not always easy to apply this individual level treatment. So the other thing you can do, as I mentioned, is to target treatment to groups when they need it. You can do this using fecal worm egg counts because now you just want a group average, so you don't need to sample each individual animal. You can actually go onto the pasture or onto an area of sheep. You can get the dogs to hold the sheep in a corner of clean pasture, for example, or cattle are even easier. You just go out in the morning, take a scoop of feces from 10-15 animals. You can get a fecal egg count from that, and you can monitor very easily the average worm levels in that group. That will help you avoid unnecessary treatments. For example, if you were thinking of bringing them in to worm them, you could do this in advance, and if you don't find eggs, you don't need to treat. It's also a really useful thing to do after you worm them to check that wormers are working, and this is something that I think should become a routine part of farming, really, to check 7 to 14 days after worming, depending on the product, and to check before and after, so that you know the level of reduction you're getting and you pick up on those problems before they become serious. However, what fecal egg counts aren't great at group level is imposing a fixed threshold and deciding, like in that individual study I showed you, that if egg counts are above some arbitrary figure like 200 eggs per gram, we're going to treat those, and if it's below, we're not. It doesn't really work like that for a couple of reasons. The first is way back the first slide I showed you that we're aiming for early season suppression. So in the first part of summer, you actually want to keep egg counts really low. You don't want them to creep up over a threshold because that's putting out a lot of eggs onto the pasture, which means that later you might have to worm more later in the season. You end up using more wormer because you've willingly contaminated your pastures. The consequences of treating the whole group and leaving only survivors to seed the pasture with resistant worms, the consequences of that depend on what you're grazing. So if you're grazing a paddock or a field that's not going to be used again for a long time, or there's going to be close to silage, maybe it's going to be ploughed up, maybe it's going to be grazed by a different stock, you don't have to worry so much about that. But if that field has to be used for those stock for a long period, then you have to worry about what you're leaving on that pasture. And that's when you need to start to think much more about holding back on wormer or applying targeted treatment at group or individual level. And that requires forward planning. It's not a matter of, should I worm now? I can't answer that question. The vet can't answer the question. You can't answer that question unless you know what you plan to do with that field. And I think that requires a bit of a change of mindset from focusing on the animals wherever they are to focusing on what they're leaving on the pasture in terms of the level of infection, but also how strongly you've selected those worms for resistance by regular or prolonged treatment of the whole group. So that requires forward planning of what you're going to do with those fields later in the season. And that's an individual farm decision. So that's not something you will get as a new protocol from a webinar. That's something you have to think through in terms of what you plan to do on your farm each year. So to sum up then, the landscape of worm control is changing. You can't really rely on a one-size-fits-all protocol anymore. You have to think through it a bit more. It's not necessarily a matter of worming less overall, but it's about targeting the worming better to support production, maybe at individuals or at groups, using the right product, the right time with the right dose, and making sure that you preserve some of what we call refugia to make sure that you're not selecting strongly for resistance. There are places you can turn to for more detailed advice, and I think we have some time for questions also. So thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Eric, for that really comprehensive look at the challenges around worming strategies. So I've just got a few questions that I'd like to raise now, and perhaps I'll direct this first one at Eric. So as we're about to look ahead to turnout, what should livestock farmers be starting to think about now?
Well, it's about that forward planning, isn't it? It's what animals are you going to put where and how long are they going to be there? And therefore, how do you want to look after those pastures, not just those animals? So if you are going to keep animals on the same pasture for a long time, then that means they need good protection, but you also have to be careful that you're not selecting strongly for resistance on those pastures. If you have options for rotation, not just between fields, but perhaps with electric fencing within fields in terms of parcels, you can plan forward so that you combine your worming with those movements in the best possible way. Unfortunately, a lot of the rotational grazing has a return interval of about 1 month, and that's kind of optimal for parasite transmission. So you do have to think through a little bit what the worms are doing.
Great, thank you. And for those farmers that perhaps in the past have been quite heavily reliant on wormers, what advice would you give them now to help them challenge that way of thinking and do things differently in the future?
I would say don't do too much too soon, honestly. It's tempting when I've shown you different things that you could do. Don't try and do everything all at once. There are risks involved in doing this. So certainly if you like the idea of targeting to individual animals, then maybe pull back just a little bit. If you're going to do that targeted selective treatment of individuals, be very cautious and keep watching those animals. If you're going to not worm a proportion, don't go in guns blazing and leave half of them untreated and then forget about them, and then they scour and they lose production. Just leave a couple of the strongest ones untreated and keep an eye until you're comfortable with it, and then see if you can go further. Same with groups. I think a big thing you can do is maybe introduce a little bit of flexibility. So if you have a protocol of you're going to worm a turnout and you're going to have whole season coverage, you've nowhere to go from that. Whereas if you've got options to turn out leave them for a little while, then bring them back into worm a little bit later, maybe use products that give you more flexibility, then you can start to introduce a little bit of targeting within your existing regime without tearing it all up and trying to worm a lot less urgently. So it's kind of baby steps and working with what works on your farm that is the lowest risk, not taking chances with things like lungworm and fluke also.
And for someone that's wanting to do more targeted treatment, what is the best way of identifying which categories of stock they should be targeting? So
again, you can address this in two ways: from the individuals, which I think we've covered quite well, how you can pick out those you can afford to leave. And then at group level, of course, you've got different classes of stock. So that comes into your grazing management as well. I think this has been used very effectively, for example, where you've had young stock that are on pasture for a long time and wormed a lot, then you're going to leave potentially highish levels of contamination, but also quite resistant worms on that pasture. So maybe there's another class of stock, maybe adults, maybe rams, maybe something that can come in that you can afford not to worm so much, that's maybe going to help you control the contamination. So again, if you're going to do this gradually, you obviously have to prioritize those stock that you want to be most productive and that are most susceptible or vulnerable to worms, and maybe you can have a little bit more leeway in older class of stock, provided they've had enough exposure in the past to have some immunity, and you can use them a little bit to test out lower worming approaches.
Great, thank you. And once you've found or discovered which category of stock you want to be targeting that treatment at, then how do you go about deciding which product that you should be using?
Yeah, so I think the key thing there is bear in mind which parasite you're trying to aim for. So if you're using combinations, for example, against fluke and against nematodes, then you very often don't get a strong overlap in when you should be using those products. So one half of the combination is just being thrown in at a time when it's not particularly useful for control, but it's still selecting for resistance. So try to pick a product that is aimed at the parasite you're aiming for, and also use one that's effective. So they say the most expensive wormer is one that doesn't work. Don't just go with a tried and trusted, the one you've been using for years, because that might be the one that you've got resistance. Don't just go for the cheapest. You might have resistance, and you're not going to know if you haven't checked. So that's why I think even this pooled fecal egg count at treatment and afterwards should become routine, because you get to know what's working and you should use something that works.
And Sinead, do you want to add anything about product selection?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I'd obviously agree with the points that Eric have raised, and I think it follows the theme that we've been on throughout this webinar, really, is understand why you're doing what you're doing, understand what your objectives are when it comes to treatment, and select a product that is going to achieve those objectives, but also think what the outcome of that treatment is going to be. Are you going to select for resistance? And if once you've thought about what the outcome of that is going to be, then look at what steps you can put into place to mitigate against the risks that treatment might bring. But I think the message, as always, is there's no one size fits all solution, and looking at farm level risk is really key, and going down the most appropriate route once you've addressed that risk is the way we should be addressing things these days.
And following on from that, Sinead, when you decided which category of stock you're going to target and which product you're going to use, what are your tips for getting the most out of those treatments?
Yeah, so we've talked very much about the big picture concepts this evening. But as Eric said earlier, there are small changes you can make which can have a big impact on the sustainability of the approaches you take. And I think, the messages we as a company at Boehringer Ingelheim have been trying to get across for a while now are to look at the way you approach treatment once you've decided on what product to use, to look at how you can optimize the efficacy of that treatment. And a lot of those steps are quite simple. It's things like making sure you are weighing your animals appropriately or assessing their weight appropriately, and dosing carefully according to weight. Using appropriate equipment as well, to make sure that the product is being administered as it should be, so it works as you expect. When you purchase, when you're prescribed an anthelmintic product, within the box is a data sheet, and we'd always advocate that farmers refer to that data sheet periodically, or when they're using a product for the first time, just to check they're using it as it should be used, and that their expectations of what that product can do are actually going to be met.
Perfect, thank you. And bringing Eric back in, following those treatments, what should farmers be doing to monitor the efficacy of those treatments?
Well, I think the simplest thing you can do really is to do these pooled fecal egg counts, maybe on the day that you're treating, and then depending on the product, it will be about 10 days later. The actual day isn't critical. If you use these pooled egg counts, you'll just get a single number for the percent reduction in egg counts. And that's not giving you a very, very accurate figure. But if you're doing this regularly, pretty much every time you treat, if you can, then you'll easily be able to see if you're starting to get a drop-off in efficacy. to get a proper fecal egg count reduction test where you've got a really accurate result means taking individual samples, and being very accurate in your dosing as well to confirm resistance. And there's been a lot of focus on that, and I think that's important in some circumstances. But if that puts you off doing any kind of monitoring, then it's counterproductive. You should be monitoring how many eggs are there and how many eggs are left, over time, and that it gives you the best indication of confidence that the wormer is working, and the earliest indication that it's falling off and you need to do something different.
Great, thank you. And finally, just to both of you, what would be your kind of take-home message, the one top tip that you hope that our listeners will be able to take back with them and implement on their own systems?
As I think we've touched on already, spring is the perfect time to review how you're approaching parasite control, to perhaps question why you're doing what you're doing, make sure that what you're doing is suitable for your own farm and your own system. So I'd encourage all farmers to take that opportunity to put in a plan that is perhaps a little bit more sustainable this season and takes the broad range of considerations Eric's run through into account. Secondly, from Boehringer Ingelheim, as a company that manufacture anthelmintics, we're really keen that our products continue to perform as we'd expect on farms. And so if you do have concerns or questions, then reach out to us directly or through your vet or the person prescribing your anthelmintics, and we can help provide support to make sure that you are able to control parasites optimally on your farm.
Yeah, I'd second that, really, that worming has become a bit of habit, I think, something that you don't have to think too much about often. And I think just stopping and asking yourselves why you're doing it this way is probably the most valuable step. And maybe moving on from just worming and forgetting about it, so that you can carry on with your pasture use how you want and everything else, just to question that, and maybe do seek help if you need more advice. This is complicated. You're not going to be able to replace a really simple protocol with something that's equally simple. So get the vet involved, start that discussion, make sure that you're not alone in this, and like I said before, don't try and change too much too soon, but do question the status quo and why you're doing what you're doing, and could you do something a little bit different without any risks.
That brings us to the end of the webinar. Thank you for joining us. We hope that you found it informative. And thank you especially to Professor Eric Morgan and Sinead Timothy for providing their expertise. The webinar is available on playback, and to access this and more information and details of how to sign up for future webinars, please go to the website links that are showing now. Thank you and good night.